Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Robot Project. We're going to spend the next week or so working, building a robot, and this project is really intended for you to refine the workflow. We're going to focus on some lighting issues and some aesthetic issues, and some presentation issues. So now, in terms of the modeling of this project, you already know about 95% of all of the things that you need to know in order to make the geometry for this project, okay, or at least you've been exposed to it. So we're going to focus on reinforcing some of the workflow, and the concept here is that we're going to build based on what we know. We'll certainly explore some things as well, but obviously we're not going to have a whole lot of reference on hand for this robot project. Now, you might have some toys floating around, you know, maybe some research might entail going to a toy store, or maybe if you have kids or nephews or nieces or cousins, or maybe you have some toys of your own, you can take a look at, if you happen to have some kind of robot for influence. But of course, I did provide a robots folder, and you can find that in the Blackboard site. I'm assuming you've already found some of this content. If you go into the Robot Micro project, there are some resources here. The first resource is the robot inspiration, and I've already downloaded that and unzipped it, and I have this robot example folder. In addition to that, there's a couple of additional links just kind of for fun and to get you thinking about your robot. The first one is an animation, This Way Up. That's worth watching. That was made in Cinema 4D. It was that was actually came out of the Cinema 4D Cafe Challenge project, which is the same place that the syllabus references for any extra credit for this class. I'll talk more about that towards the end of this course. And then just a little comic, If I Was a Robot. In addition to that, there's this Miro DeviantArt. Miro is a cloud application that you can find at the following link. It's miro.deviantart.com. And all Miro is, it's basically kind of a substitute for Photoshop. So if you don't have Photoshop, this will allow you to do some basic sketching of a concept. So this is kind of a really cool tool, and I'll demonstrate this here in just a minute, but I just wanted to explain to you what the links were to get started. Now, I'll come back to Miro in just a minute. I want to jump inside the robot examples folder. Most of these are 3D. Not all of them. Some of them are two-dimensional, just illustrations either in Photoshop or another application. So all of these files that I put together, I just found these basically, searching the web over the course of a couple of semesters. A lot of it came out of CG Society, which is the website that I link in the resources section, both in the discussion board and a few other places online. So basically, I'm just opening up all of the contents of this folder into a quick slideshow. I'm not going to talk about all of these. In fact, I'll just kind of shuffle through a few of these. But as I shuffle through, believe it or not, that's actually a 3D render. That's not a painting or an illustration. So if you look at some of these, the concept here is not that we're going to try to recreate something that looks like this necessarily. I mean, certainly we could attempt to, but the expectation is not that it ends up looking like this, but that you look at this content and you find influence from it. So when I look at any one of these robots, it basically, mechanically, we can kind of make some sense out of it. There's some logical attachments, and there's kind of some nuts and bolts and kind of strategies for making content look like it should be attached. There's a lot of, kind of flair and aesthetic decisions that have been added to make this look like a logically functioning piece of machinery. So there's kind of some logical connections, and there's, there's joints where there intends to be joints, and there's just lots of details hidden in here. And so each one of these robots, some are a little bit more simple than others. This is basically just a combination of lots of different geometric shapes, and we'll see several of those inside this folder. So we can get kind of a lot of character built with some basic 3D shapes. Now, again, this is a 3D model that's put together. Now, I suspect that any one of these individual shapes, for the most part, or I'd say like 95% of the shapes that you see here, you have the basic knowledge to create any one of those shapes. This robot is put together by assembling lots of different sort of simple pieces of geometry, and some of them have some, you know, really clear nuance. You know, the general shape of this body is a sphere, but there's, you know, kind of a nuanced shape, and there's, you know, kind of some caps or some plates that have been added. You know, the shape of the arm, it's not just a straight cylinder. There's some bulges here, and there's some ridges, and so on. But for the most part, this content, again, 95% of it, you could look at it and say, oh yeah, there's, you know, a cylinder or a sphere. This ring could be, you know, some kind of cylinder or a disc or a tube, or you know, these brackets, we built something kind of like that when we looked at the lamp, and so on. And these are just lots of different small, complex shapes that are assembled to make even a more bigger complex shape. So that's going to be the basic strategy. And the key here is that, you know, we don't want to design this in a vacuum. It's going to be really easy to kind of create some basic shapes on screen, throw them together and say, okay, I have my robot. But really to kind of think about how things attach, sort of like we did with the lamp. You know, we want to start to build concepts for how things might attach, and before we know it, we'll have a pretty fully realized robot on our hands. So I'll attempt a couple of different strategies. Believe it or not, this is a 3D render as well. It looks more like a painting or an illustration, but that's 3D rendering with some post-production handled probably in Photoshop. So again, if you shuffle through a lot of these, and I'll go through some of these pretty quickly, here's a really nice character sheet, or a concept sheet for a character. The nice thing about this solution is that they kind of show the concept drawings, the 2D drawings, and then how it translates to 3D. Here's a robot. Again, a lot of character was achieved with some really simple shapes. And a lot of that has to do with the proportion and the posing of this thing. It's basically just, you know, this is a series of cubes, essentially, that have been kind of scaled and deformed in some places. But I think with the exception of that pin that runs through the hip here, I think we're looking just at a series of cubes that have been modeled. So again, this isn't really a robot, but this is just a 3D scene that includes a lot of geometry that looks very mechanical. So we can find influence in a lot of these things. And by all means, don't just rely on the examples that I've provided, but find your own examples to find influence in. So a lot of these are Cinema 4D. So this is a Cinema 4D render. This is a Cinema 4D render. And this, you know, I suspect that we could probably build this based on what we know. It might not be rendered as well, and there's some things in here that we might say, well, I don't know how to build that. Well, I think if you just, you know, discover the right tools to use, the basic modeling strategy we have, and that's, you know, part of the goal of this project. So this is a Cinema 4D render, and one of the things that we're going to talk about is the presentation. The presentation of this is much more compelling than anything we did with the desk scene. And so by design, we'll focus on not only just the modeling, but also the rendering and then the presentation of this. It's very helpful if you have Photoshop or access to Photoshop and some previous knowledge in Photoshop. If you don't be concerned, because we'll you know, we'll talk about some strategies that get you up and running either in Photoshop or some alternative strategies that we can render straight out of Cinema 4D. So again, lots of Cinema 4D work. This is Cinema 4D. This is Cinema 4D. Some really great examples. And one of the things that we'll experiment here is in some cases you'll see what's referred to as a three-point turn. This is a three-point turn of the model. So it's showing us, you know, a couple of different perspectives all in one render. Now, this could have been rendered all in Cinema 4D by modeling the robot, copying it, and turning it. Or it could have been 3 different renders that were then composited in Photoshop. And so we'll take a look at strategies to do that. So, but this three-quarter turn, or three-point turn, and sometimes referred to as, you know, the number of points, this might be referred to as a 4-point turn. Here just kind of shows the different views of the model that's created. One of the interesting things about this presentation is that we're seeing the front of the robot, we're seeing the back of the robot, and then we're seeing wireframes of the robot. So it really kind of shows the geometry and how this was created. We'll experiment with that in this presentation. And one last thing is that if you look at the background is actually just a blurred version of one of these renders, probably this back render. That's probably the exact same pose that we're looking at if you look in the back. So that's the strategy, same strategy here. It's basically just a version of this render that's pushed into the background and blurred. And we might experiment with some strategies like that. So again, that's more Cinema 4D. These are actual objects. These aren't illustrations or 3D models. These are photographs of kind of found objects that were assembled. And I thought that, we could model something like this. If we look at these shapes, we might be able to recognize many of these shapes. And again, these are just kind of an assembly of found objects. We could use that strategy in Cinema 4D to model a bunch of things that we know or that we can reference in our real space here, in the real world, and then assemble those together to make something that looks like a robot. So some of these robots might look familiar. These are not robots at all. These are actually binoculars, those binoculars that you feed 25 cents in for a timed view, maybe at like Niagara Falls or, some kind of an overlook. But they kind of have this robot feel to them, and you might find inspiration in objects that aren't necessarily robots, but this to me would make a really great robot head. So maybe even a foot as well if we turn it upside down. So again, more 3D content. Some of these might be recognizable. Okay, and again, I'm going to shuffle through these really quickly because you should have access to this. Now this is kind of compelling because it's all just a series of spheres. There's some textures that become kind of interesting, and there's kind of a complex shape here happening on this uppermost sphere. But we'll see in a couple of cases that some of these robots are just a series of really simple shapes that are arranged and posed in a way that really kind of bring them to life. Okay, here's a great example. These are some really simple shapes, but assembled in a way that makes this a really extremely compelling robot. So, maybe we'll build a concept that looks kind of like this, or a combination of some things that we see that we find influence in. So, one of the themes that I see emerging here in some of the robots that we're looking at is that there's a lot of character that's being added by kind of sticking the head on the front of the torso. If we're thinking about this, we might have the tendency to kind of stack the head on top of the shoulders here, but in some of these cases they're kind of changing the position or juxtaposing the head and putting it in kind of an interesting situation. That gives this a lot of character, okay, just by sticking the head in the front. In fact, when I do a quick sketch, maybe I'll sketch something like that out. So again, some of these are toys, some of these are real world real world objects, and some of them are 3D renders, and sometimes it's really hard to tell. Here's a 2D map or plan for a robot. Okay, so again, I'm just going to shuffle through these really quickly and take a closer look at these. There's some really great solutions in here. I love the idea of seeing a light bulb kind of attached to the robot. It's kind of this older technology that is being utilized by the robot. So, okay, so take a look at these. This was the one that I wanted to conclude on. There's a few more robots in here, but these are all just cubes, or cubes that have been scaled and exaggerated in one way or another. And if you look here, you'd have a hard time finding something that didn't start out as a cube, or isn't still a recognizable cube that might have a taper on it, or scaled on one end, and just arranged in a really specific way to create a tremendous amount of character. And again, we see this kind of 3-point turn happening. We see the front of the robot, we see a side profile, and then the back of the robot. So this is a pretty basic concept that we're going to want to employ so that we can fully realize our robot and really kind of see the geometry and the strategy that went into it. And of course, once we get it built, we'll pose it into something that looks a little bit more interesting. So that's the basic concept for this project. I wanted to get this kickoff video in place and out to you, and what we'll do in the next couple of presentations is I'll jump into Miro and I'll do a really quick sketch or a couple of sketches, just kind of trying to think through what my robot is going to look like or how to get started. Because what we don't want to do is we don't want to look at these robots and then just immediately jump in and say, okay, well, I'm going to start out with a couple of cubes and see what I end up with. I really kind of want to think about the relationship between the head and the rest of the body, the torso and the legs, and really kind of think through the different shapes. Now, there is no requirement to use Miro or Photoshop or anything, or Illustrator or something similar to it, but it really is a good idea to kind of sketch out your ideas before you get started, to kind of come up with a concept in 3D, because I suspect that most of you are familiar with Photoshop or sketching pencil on paper, more familiar with that than you might be in Cinema 4D, and a lot of times you can get at concepts really quickly and not be inhibited by the new tool set that you're trying to learn. So we'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a minute. So we'll catch up in the next presentation.